Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida Fair Tax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, March 8th, 2024. Your tax return may be on your neighbor's laptop. One of the most frustrating things that Americans must do is prepare and file federal income tax returns every year, which disclose confidential information to the IRS. Now, the IRS assures us that our information is highly protected, and we're further assured that only authorized IRS personnel will have access to our data and that it will be used solely for the purpose of assuring income tax compliance. Enter Charles Littlejohn. Now, Littlejohn was an IRS contractor who was recently sentenced to 5 years in prison. His crime? Stealing confidential tax data and leaking it to a number of media outlets. Well, not surprisingly, this has led to a great deal of skepticism among taxpayers over just how secure our sensitive personal data really is. Now, how do we know that others within the IRS aren't taking our Social Security numbers, our bank account numbers, and other data and selling it to people who will use it to steal from our accounts? How do we know that our personal information won't be leaked by someone inside the IRS trying to push a political agenda? Well, we don't. And the recent report and testimony from the IRS Commissioner has given us even more reason to worry that our confidential data is not as secure as the IRS would have us believe it is. Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, or TIGTA, T-I-G-T-A, responded to the Littlejohn IRS breach in a report on IRS security for taxpayer information. Here's some key points from that report. The IRS does not have adequate controls to detect or prevent the unauthorized removal of data by users. As of July 13, 2023, our analysis of BEARS, that's an acronym for Business Entitlements Access Request System, that data identified 153,120 users who currently have or had access to an IRS information technology system, and of which 13,321 are contractors. Further, of these 153,120 users, 91,661 have or had access to one or more of the 276 sensitive systems included in our evaluation. Our assessment of the 91,661 users determined that actions were not always taken to remove users from the system in a timely manner once they separated from the IRS. For example, we identified 279 users who are listed in the BEARS system as separated as of July 13, 2023, but continue to have access to at least one IRS-sensitive system. Of the 5,068 users listed in BEARS as contractors, 19 contractors' most recent background investigations were not favorable as of July 13, 2023. But these contractors still retain their access to one or more sensitive systems because the IRS did not take action to suspend or disable the contractors from the IRS system as required. And finally, the fact remains that the IRS should have suspended or disabled these contractors' access until a favorable determination was on file. We're concerned that these individuals who are not considered suitable for IRS employment were retained as contractors and were given access to sensitive systems. The TIGTA report is frightening, but the actual security of our confidential information is much, much worse than what was shown by that report. IRS Commissioner Danny Werfel told the House Ways and Means Committee on February 15th that tens of thousands of people had their private tax files stolen by the recently sentenced thief Charles Littlejohn. Werfel also testified that only 50% of IRS employees come into the office for work. The other 50% work remotely. And he admitted that many of these agents working remotely don't use government-issued devices. They access our highly sensitive taxpayer data using their own laptops and phones. Now let that sink in for a minute. IRS employees are accessing our confidential taxpayer information, mostly from their own homes with no supervision, using their own personal devices. They're not working from a secure location on highly protected devices, but on their personal home devices that might be accessed by roommates or others. What could possibly go wrong? Picture an IRS employee looking at your records, walking away for a bathroom break, but not shutting down the laptop screen. A roommate who has no business seeing your confidential data walks by, takes a picture, and sends it to someone else. In conclusion, the question is, how can our members of Congress continue to force us to file tax returns containing our confidential information, even though they know that this supposed confidentiality is a myth? Isn't it time to eliminate this dreadful income payroll tax system? Now, the choice is easy. Do we want a system for funding the federal government that is so simple that everyone can understand it? That shows the cost of the federal government on every retail receipt so all of us understand what we're paying? That helps U.S. companies compete with foreign competitors? That keeps jobs in the U.S. rather than exporting them to other countries? That permanently establishes the solvency of Social Security and Medicare, and that is the largest transfer of power from D.C. to the people since the Constitution was adopted? Now, D.C. is ignoring the one real solution that allows us to remain citizens and not subjects, the fair tax. The fair tax is simple, it's non-invasive, but most of all, it works. Now, if you don't like the idea of the IRS and D.C. requiring you to reveal more and more of your private financial data and changing us from citizens to subjects in the process, you should be helping us pass the fair tax. Under the fair tax, there are no more tax returns. You no longer have to disclose your personal financial information to the government. Banks and other financial institutions no longer have to tell the government about dividends and interest you received or about how much you made trading stocks, bonds, and other capital assets. With the fair tax, there is no need for the government to know anything about your IRA because you won't need an IRA. The fair tax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. And, of course, if the government doesn't have your confidential financial data, they can't leak it. In addition to solving the confidentiality problem, the fair tax lets business owners concentrate on making their businesses more profitable and beneficial for both their shareholders and their employees. President Biden and Congress, do the right thing. Pass the fair tax. Fix the broken income payroll tax system. You can go down in history as the ones who freed all present and future Americans from the tyranny of the income payroll tax system. You can ensure that there can be no more leaks of our confidential information, and you can transfer power back to the American people over how much tax they pay. The fair tax does indeed transfer power from Congress and the bureaucrats to the people. We, not D.C., will decide how much federal tax we pay. And with the fair tax, there is no IRS. The states collect the fair tax. And only retail businesses will have to collect the fair tax and remit it to the government. Now, since 10% of the retailers account for 90% of retail purchases, there will be much less opportunity for evasion. So, why would D.C. pass the fair tax and give up an almost unlimited source of donations? Well, they won't, at least not voluntarily. The only way they will is if the rest of us demand it. Now, isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? Now, there's going to be a vote on the fair tax in the House of Representatives. We now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to show where they stand. They can vote for the present income payroll tax system, or they can vote for the fair tax. They can support the corrupt income tax in the IRS, or they can vote to eliminate it. It can't be any simpler than that. They can hide the true cost of their government, or they can pass the fair tax and show everyone the true cost of government on every retail receipt. And finally, they can support the largest transfer of power from government to the people, the fair tax, or they can vote against it. Now, if members think the fair tax needs to be amended to address a problem, then they can propose that change. Don't let them get away with rejecting the entire bill because it has a perceived flaw that can be easily addressed. And don't think for an instant there aren't any flaws in the income tax. Please stand with us and demand that your representatives support a much fairer, much simpler, and much more efficient way to fund the government, the fair tax. The fair tax doesn't pick winners and losers. Because it taxes spending, not earnings, the fair tax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. The fair tax will allow us to take back control. The income payroll tax system is broken. It's no longer working. We can't repair it, but we can replace it with the fair tax. Join us and take back control of our country and our lives, not with bullets, but with the elimination of one of the biggest threats to our liberty and economic prosperity, the income payroll tax. We should all remember Edmund Burke's warning that applies to our efforts to take back control. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. We should also remember this quote from George Orwell's 1984, which, if we do nothing, may foretell your and your children's future. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So what can each of us do? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives and attend Zoom town hall meetings demanding that if they really want to allow Americans to take back control, the first step is to eliminate the income payroll tax system and enact the fair tax. Take back control. Help us pass the fair tax. Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing or investing $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. Now, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to fairtax.org and invest in AFFT. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at fairtax.org.